You ever heard of an HOA sending out fake cops? Sounds crazy, right? Well, that's exactly what happened in my neighborhood, and the mess it created nearly tore the community apart. It started with letters, the kind that look official but carry the sting of harassment rather than justice. The first one slapped onto my doorstep read, "Violation notice, improper vehicle placement. Fine, $200. The ridiculous part? My car was parked neatly in my own driveway, nowhere near the street or blocking anyone's view. The next envelope landed just 3 days later. Violation, excessive lawn length. Fine, $150. That one made me laugh bitterly because I had mowed the yard the evening before, but the third letter nearly made my blood boil. It read, "Final warning. Multiple violations recorded. Possible eviction if no compliance within 10 days. Eviction from property that wasn't even legally under the HOA's jurisdiction." My land sat just outside their covenant lines, and yet the Oakfield Heights HOA acted like they owned my soil, my grass, and even my driveway. The nerve of it all wasn't just insulting, it was unlawful, and at the center of it stood their president, a woman named Martha Crane. Martha strutted around like she was sheriff of the Wild West, binder tucked under her arm like a badge of authority, quoting rules and bylaws that half the neighborhood didn't even agree to. She thrived on intimidation, loved holding meetings where she could announce standards with a smug smile, and carried herself as though being HOA president meant she was above the law. One hot afternoon, I had had enough. I stormed straight into the HOA clubhouse, a cramped building that smelled like stale coffee and cleaning chemicals. Martha sat at the head of a long table, 2 board members at her side looking worn out and uninterested, like people forced into a play they didn't want to be in. I slapped the stack of bogus fines onto the table and said, 3 violations. In 1 week, Martha. You know my property isn't under your HOA. This is harassment. Her smirk didn't twitch. Our community has expectations, she said flatly. Your property borders ours, and your behavior reflects on us. If you won't comply, we'll escalate. Her voice carried the kind of cold arrogance only bullies could pull off. I narrowed my eyes. Escalate to what? You don't have any jurisdiction here. Her smile faltered just slightly, then hardened again. You think living outside our covenant protects you? You'll see what happens when people ignore community standards. We can make your life very difficult. That was no longer about lawns or vehicles, that was a direct threat. Her board members squirmed in their chairs but didn't intervene. I left that clubhouse with my pulse hammering, realizing this wasn't just about petty fines. Martha wanted control, and people like her didn't stop until they were forced to. A week later, I had to leave town for contract work. I wasn't thrilled about going, especially with tensions boiling, but work was work and bills don't pay themselves. Before leaving, I sat down with my younger sister Sarah, who was staying at my house while I was away. Keep the doors locked. If anyone comes by pretending they're in charge, don't answer. And if anything looks wrong, call Sheriff Dalton immediately. She nodded firmly. What I didn't know was that while I was packing my bags, Martha was already planning her next move. According to a neighbor, she'd been spotted outside the clubhouse late at night, whispering with 3 strange men who definitely weren't board members. Rough-looking guys, not the kind who cared about bylaws or landscaping rules. Then another neighbor messaged me while I was on the road. There's a white SUV circling your driveway. 3 men inside wearing vests that say HOA police. That's... When it hit me, Martha wasn't content with sending letters anymore. She was escalating into something darker. She had hired muscle dressed up like fake cops to intimidate whoever was home. Only she didn't realize who she was about to mess with, because Sarah wasn't alone in the house. My nephew Allie had just returned from military service overseas. 6 feet tall, lean but strong, sharp eyes that had seen more in deployment than most men see in a lifetime. He hadn't told many people he was back yet, wanting to surprise me after my trip. Instead, he was about to surprise Martha's fake cops. The sheriff's presence had changed everything, but the storm that Karen had unleashed was far from over. As the flashing lights faded and the initial chaos settled, whispers spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Parents gathered there, children close, neighbors exchanged uneasy glances, and the sense of relief that had briefly washed over them was quickly replaced by the cold weight of reality. This wasn't just a random outburst, it was a dangerous escalation. Karen was not done, and deep down, everyone knew it. The very next morning, she reappeared in the cul-de-sac, this time with her husband trailing behind her. He looked exhausted, shoulders slumped, as though he'd spent the night arguing with her, but Karen's eyes burned with even more fury. She pointed toward the very house where the sheriff had stood the night before, shouting about how the law had humiliated her and promising that she would take revenge. Parents ushered children indoors, blinds were pulled shut, and yet no one could truly ignore her because her voice carried across the entire street. It was like watching a storm cloud build overhead, ready to burst again at any second. What none of the neighbors expected, though, was that Karen had been busy overnight filing false HOA complaints against multiple families, accusing them of breaking rules that didn't even exist. One neighbor was accused of having illegal decorations, another was accused of storing hazardous vehicles, and yet another was targeted for creating public disturbances. But the most shocking complaint was aimed at the very family whose daughter she had struck, claiming they were endangering children by allowing them outside unsupervised. It was a twisted attempt at flipping the narrative, painting herself as the victim. When letters arrived in mailboxes the next day, fury erupted. Families stormed out of their homes, waving the fraudulent notices in the air. A small crowd formed in front of Karen's driveway, shouting at her to stop lying and harassing the neighborhood. But Karen, instead of backing down, doubled down. She screamed that she was protecting community standards and that outsiders didn't belong here. Her husband stood silently beside her, his face pale, as if he wanted to sink into the ground. The situation was ready to boil over again, but this time, the community wasn't about to let Karen hold power over them anymore. A group of parents organized quickly, setting up a neighborhood meeting without Karen's knowledge. They decided to document everything, every threat, every false claim, every scream, and deliver it straight to the sheriff's department along with a petition demanding legal action. Within days, deputies returned, but not to check on the family Karen had harassed. Instead, they marched straight up to Karen's front door. The neighborhood watched as the deputies knocked, explained the situation, and presented her with official warnings for filing false complaints and for harassment. Karen's shrieking could be heard from inside as she argued with the officers, but ultimately she was left standing in her doorway, red-faced and shaking, with a clear message. Her reign of intimidation was over. Relief washed over the neighborhood, but it was bittersweet. Parents knew the scars of Karen's chaos would linger. Children still whispered about the angry lady who yelled at everyone, and some were still too scared to play outside. Yet there was also a newfound unity. Neighbors who had only exchanged polite nods before now stood side by side, supporting each other, looking out for one another's families. Karen had tried to divide them, but instead she had forged them together like never before. The sheriff's warning wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a neighborhood that refused to be bullied again. And though Karen's blinds stayed drawn and her driveway empty for weeks, everyone knew she was still inside, watching, plotting, waiting. But now, if she dared to lash out again, the community was ready. And this time, she wouldn't just face angry neighbors, she'd face the full weight of the law.